In this episode, we meet Aaron Hendry, co-founder of Kickback and the driving force behind the front door, a single point of entry for rangatahi experiencing homelessness. Aaron came to this work as a young youth worker in West Auckland, sitting with a 16-year-old who had been sleeping at a bus stop. Confident there would be a system for this, he rang Work and Income. Too young, they said. He rang CYFS. Too old for them too. That clarity never left him. In this episode, Aaron talks about the pipelines the state has built directly into homelessness. The care system, the justice system, the health system, and why over 60% of the rangatahi coming through the front door are Māori, and why that cannot be separated from colonisation and land loss. He talks about Wales and what Aotearoa could choose to do now: a duty to assist, a duty to refer, and a duty to collaborate. 3 legislative obligations that would mean no young person is ever again discharged from a hospital, a prison, or state care into nothing. And he talks about why it has to be law, not policy, because policy falls away with a change of government. More information on this interview can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Cha Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.
Aaron, thank you so much for having us here in your space on K Road, here in the centre of Tāmaki, Auckland. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've come to be doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, kia ora. I'm kind of te tiriti. I've got mixed whakapapa, Irish, Scottish, Turkish, Italian. Grew up out in Riverhead, Coatesville out in West Auckland. Massey's where I feel most connected, and Massey's also, it's where I met my wife, Summer, and we've got 3 kids who live there now, and it's also where I started youth work, right? And we met together actually serving young people in our local community, and came face to face with the reality of inequality and poverty and homelessness in our community. And I guess one of the things as a young youth worker I got really frustrated about was we used to have all these adults and professionals saying, just get them in school, get them a job. But the reality for our young people was, lack of safety at home. Most of the boys that, especially in those early days that I was supporting, that didn't have dads in their lives. Their dads were in prison, right? Their whānau were living in really substandard housing, often overcrowded. Homelessness was a huge thing that our kids were dealing with. And all the adults in their life seemed to be focused on just getting these kids in school, getting them a job. But the reality is that they weren't safe, that their living situation wasn't safe. And actually there was much bigger structural inequalities going on that those kids and their whānau didn't have the tools or ability to deal with. And so I guess I became really passionate around how do we change the system? How do we ensure that actually there is equity and that all young people have a safe, stable place to live? And I guess that's been a bit of my focus.
So was that the birthplace of the idea for Kickback? Could you walk us through a little bit about what Kickback is and how it works?
Yeah. I guess there was a seed, right? I ended up from there, became passionate about youth work, became passionate about youth development. So the real power of what a stable, safe relationship can do, and that role around just like unconditional aroha and love and belief for our rangatahi, how powerful that can be. I worked in a range of places. I worked with Tawananga, Aotearoa for a period of time as a relief kāko, and then lead youth worker when they started their West Auckland sites, and I worked at Youthline when the youth services contract was beginning, and did a whole range of different kind of mahi there. But wherever I went, there was a real focus on youth homelessness. It was almost this open secret that rangatahi were experiencing homelessness disproportionately, and there was just no options back then specifically. And I remember this one specific situation where the young person come into our office when I was over at Youthline. We're doing the youth payment mahi, and he'd been sleeping out on a bus stop and he had nowhere to go. And I thought, I was like, oh cool, well surely there'll be a system for this. Surely there'll be somewhere for this kid to go. And I rang up Work and Income and said, hey, I've got this young man, like he's 16, he's got nowhere to go. Can we get help with housing for him tonight? And said, oh, sorry, he's too old. He's too young. We can't help him. We don't have anything for him. So we advise you to ring CYFS at the times. So like, cool. So I rang CYFS and said, hey, got a young guy here. Like he really needs some help. He said, oh, sorry, he's actually too old for us. So we can't help him. I guess what I became really clear on was that actually the system has not thought about the needs of our rangatahi. At that point specifically, there wasn't youth housing. You could barely get access to emergency housing. It barely existed back then. And basically we had this, what was a pretty common experience for young people, that of homelessness. And yet none of the adults in the room had figured out what the process should be to care for kids in that situation. And so, yeah, I guess that was a pretty, that kind of experience was pretty foundational for me. I ended up going to LifeWise and supporting with the development of the youth housing service at the time. They and Kahu Te Kahu and some others are just starting some of those initial pilots around youth housing. So I supported to develop some of those initial youth housing projects, and again saw the power of what we can do as a community when we realise that actually, look, government's not always the best place to innovate, but they'll be able to back a project if you can get it off the ground and you can evidence it, right? And that's the work we did there, is actually just getting these projects off the ground, showing that they could work. Actually, it is possible to take a young person who's sleeping on the street tonight into housing and provide them with that housing support. It's not just possible, it's absolutely necessary. And then around 23, my wife and I made the decision for me to step out of my substantive role. And that really came from a lot of conversations about rangatahi. There was still some real critical gaps in service and support for our young people. The crisis space was a real important one that had not been looked at. There's a real lack of safe immediate accommodation for young people, and just a central space that a tamariki a rangatahi can go when they first experience homelessness. And a lot of our young people said that, if they'd had a space like this, where we are now, the front door, which is our drop-in outreach crisis centre for rangatahi on K Road, they'd had a place like this, some of the harm they experienced when they first experienced homelessness wouldn't have happened. So in 23, we brought together a group of rangatahi who had lived experience of homelessness, and we started working with them around what this place could look like, and we designed it together. And so yeah, we've been going for a couple of years now. We got the lease around 2024, opened mid-24, and then we've just been full on since then. And basically the front door is it's a drop-in, it's an outreach centre, it's a space where rangatahi can come, tamariki can come, and we just start figuring out what's needed for them. Instead of going to 1,000 doors for support, we come to one, and whether it's kai, clothing, need a shower, need somewhere to stay tonight, we deal with that first, and then we figure out the long term. In terms of Kickback as a whole, we have kind of three key focuses, innovation, advocacy, and education. So innovation, believing that actually the way we solve this massive issue of homelessness is going to take a lot of innovation. There's massive gaps in our sector and our systems at the moment. And so what we focus on is, where are those gaps? How can we innovate for change? Try to build some of the mataranga we need to close some of those gaps, with the goal that, if we can get something working, if we can prove that it works, then, maybe that can be blueprinted and used, elsewhere, right? Education, recognizing that actually there's a lot more information that's needed in our wider community around how to care for our young people. And so, we do what we can to share the knowledge that we have to ensure that we can actually work together as a community to prevent young people from experiencing homelessness and caring for them when they do. And then advocacy, right? We recognise that these two, the frontline mahi and the advocacy piece need to come together. We can't just be serving our young people walking through our doors without also asking the question around, why is this happening? We 100% believe that homelessness is preventable in Aotearoa, and youth homelessness just should not exist. And we can solve this problem. Homelessness is a problem we can solve. But we need to have, I guess, the courage and the will to actually get into the detail and figure it out. And so, we're really involved in that piece of work as well.
So I've heard you speak about this before, and the preventative aspect of youth homelessness seems to be of critical importance, because one of the greatest determinants of later life homelessness is whether you experienced it as a young person. Can you talk me through some of that root cause stuff? Just because I think a lot of people just don't know what's causing these things. You've alluded to it, in terms of safety, but we're talking substance abuse, we're talking domestic violence. What's going on out there at the moment? And are you seeing it diminish, or are you seeing it grow in New Zealand at the moment?
Yeah. Look, we're really concerned that homelessness, especially youth homelessness, is increasing, right? In terms of the pipelines and the homelessness and the drivers, it's complex. There's a whole range of different reasons that a young person or a child might experience homelessness. We know some of the leading systems into homelessness is the care system, right? Tamariki that are uplifted from care, and from care go into an experience of homelessness, which they may never come out of until they're in their late 20s, right? The justice system, where young people are entering into the justice system and basically being exited straight into homelessness. Even the health system, we see this constantly, where a young person has gone into the health system because something has occurred, whether it's their mental health or their physical health. The home isn't safe, they've gone into the health system, and then they're exited into homelessness, right? So we have these systems at the moment that are actually feeding young people straight into an experience of housing insecurity. In terms of drivers, poverty, family violence, addiction, mental health, there's a whole range of reasons why a child or a young person may experience homelessness. We do a lot of it at the front door. There's a big piece of our mahi which is about early intervention, right? And we know that actually it's the gaps between systems where our rangatahi slip through. We do a lot of work with our tamariki, so meeting tamariki at that very early stage when they may have just began sleeping rough or couch surfing, and we've met tamariki as young as 9 who've been out on our streets, right? And there's a real myth that if a child is experiencing homelessness, it's because the family are terrible people, right? Or they don't care about their kids. Like, our experience is not the case, right? 99% of the time, whānau love and care for their kids. But there are some real massive challenges that we're dealing with in New Zealand, and the poverty and inequality that we've allowed to occur in Aotearoa is absolutely unacceptable, and it affects our whānau. And so we meet whānau often who are struggling, single mums who are doing the best they can in an overcrowded house by themselves and not getting the support they need from the government agencies that are there, who don't have the resources to always be putting food on the table for their kids, or to be at every doctor's appointment, or get to the hospital because they're trying to work and they're trying to manage all these things. And so there's a real gap in being able to respond and ensure that our whānau get the support they need. And so the work we do is getting really close to the whānau, trying to understand what's going on for them, and then working to bring the services and the agencies together and just move things forward. And we see some real great success in that. But there's massive gaps in terms of the resourcing that's needed and the support that's needed for whānau to actually prevent homelessness.
Like, if we could go for a moment down the positive pathway in terms of the things that stand out for you as examples of things that are working well that we could do more of more often. And then I'm going to ask a little bit about some perhaps suggested policy change that you might be looking for. But what are some of the programs, because I know you're involved in multiple initiatives in this related space. What are some of the things that you've seen that are working really well?
Yeah, so I think there's one is innovation within the community, right? I think there's a lot of like massive heart in community in Aotearoa, right? People that are like, we see a problem, let's do what we can. And there's amazing work with organisations just stepping up and trying to fill those gaps. And just, one of our core beliefs is you don't accept the unacceptable, right? So for us, any child, young person experiencing homelessness, it's not acceptable. We'll do everything we can to ensure that that kid gets the support that they need. And I think that is an ethos that is really held in our communities. And I think especially over this last year, we've seen just so many community organisations stand up and start leading and doing what they can in their patch to support our kids. And I think that's absolutely vital. In terms of like structurally, there is opportunities, right? Where, maybe it's not working fully the way we want it to, but, the youth payment system as a whole has huge opportunity to be able to actually be a preventative measure for young people. So those are young people that come to work in income and, they've had a whānau breakdown, and, they're needing a bit of extra support, right?
And this is administered by MS.
Yep, right. Okay. So, it was brought in by, the national government, I think it was around 2008, Paul Bennett that led it. And basically the government said, look, we see this opportunity where we have all these young people coming in and, getting benefit, but they're not in school. How can we support that? And basically what they did is they, said, look, every young person should get a youth worker. They should be, getting some support with their, in the financial education. And they should get a bit more intensive support to get into school and that sort of thing. And so they created the youth payment, right? What they didn't really fully understand or maybe appreciate is that a good chunk of the young people that are coming through this doorway, especially with the criteria they set, which is you've had to have a whānau breakdown, are experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness, right? And so they never really put the right infrastructure around that to respond to that need, whether that was immediate housing support, intensive mental health addiction support alongside that, or even just the managing the caseloads. So I know that some of those youth workers are working really, really hard, and the caseloads are just too high for the work that they're doing. But there is a real opportunity through that mechanism to be starting to look at, well, actually, if we resource that system well, this is a real touch point for a huge group of rangatahi coming through the door. If you reduce the caseload, so you had youth workers working really intensively, really quickly, if you made sure that they were linked in with housing navigators and you brought that into the contract as well, and then started, looking at immediate housing services and embedding that within those programs and making sure they were kind of linked up, you'd actually go a long way into starting to prevent it for a group of young people coming through the MSD pipeline, right? One of the projects that's working really well at the moment, like we work really closely with Aotearoa, is a project called Pitamata. They do an immediate housing service for young people, and that is a real critical step as well. We know that for so long the emergency housing system, the motel-based emergency housing system, has sustained homelessness for young people and caused huge amounts of harm. So we need to start looking at what alternative models exist. And Pitamata and the leadership of Aotearoa in that service is so important. It's something that people could be looking at in terms of how they could scale up. And basically, young people coming through our doors who have real high needs in terms of, basically just significantly unwell when they're experiencing homelessness and they come, they're able to house and provide that wraparound support.
And is that in an environment where they may be separated from other, there've been some issues with transitional housing and emergency housing with the co-location of more vulnerable.
So rangatahi based environments,
right,
24/7, and they've got their own units, sort of self-contained, and and then kahui are able to pathway them into transitional or longer term housing, or we work with them to find alternative options if that's necessary. Another model that we've been working with Massey Community Trust is the safety net, which is a host home model, right? So it's about empowering local communities to respond to homelessness within their local communities, giving community the power to hold and yield their own, right? And basically what we do is we come alongside whānau who have a spare room. We ensure that we provide them with the training, vetting structure that they need to care for rangatahi, and they're able to take young people into their homes and manage that emergency immediate need. And we've seen real awesome results with that, with young people actually bypassing the welfare system altogether and being able to just have the time they need to just settle in a safe environment and stay in school, and in many cases go back home or find a private flat in their own community. So there is some cool kind of innovative stuff that is happening. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. This is what I mean. Homelessness is a problem we can solve. And if we actually step back sometimes, there are seeds and opportunities that if we could invest in and start scaling up, could actually go a long way to building an Aotearoa where no young person and no child ever slept on our streets.
So off the back of that, and acknowledging the widespread opportunities that there are, because I'm with you, I believe we can solve this. We've made a bunch of choices that have got us to where we are now, and we can make a number of different choices to ensure all New Zealanders are well housed. If I gave you a magic policy wand and you were going to use that wand to make some significant structural and policy change in the New Zealand environment, the New Zealand housing system. I'm hearing you, it's broader than that. It includes health, mental health, substance, etc. What would be some of the top priorities that you would focus on if you could change some structural stuff and some policies?
Yeah. Look, I mean, first, I think it's really important to acknowledge that what we're dealing with right now is a crisis, right? And it's a crisis of, it's a human rights crisis, right? The consequences of homelessness for whānau, for young people, for children is dire, right? I think the first thing that, I think a government really serious about dealing with this might do is actually start treating it like that, similar to how
some urgency.
With some urgency, just the way we've managed other crisis, or, think about what we've done on the pandemic, or when there's a natural disaster, and bring the relevant ministers to the table bring them relevant officials to the table and say, look, we're going to deal with this thing and create a crisis team that is actually going to start working it out. Because there is immediate things we could start doing right now that would start to alleviate pressure, and then there's long-term things that we could do. In terms of the immediate, the emergency housing policy, we'd be saying, look, that needs to be rolled back to what it was prior to the more recent changes.
So if Tama's sitting here, he's saying, well, motels are not the right place for whānau.
Yeah.
How do we respond to that?
Yeah, so 100% agree. Motels are not the right place for whānau. We advocated for that very strongly under the last government. And currently, look, there's no, I don't know any of my colleagues that actually believe that mass motel-based accommodation is the right way forward. However, what we need to do is build an alternative system beneath the current system while we're managing this. And so in terms of immediate, we need to use what we have. And so, use the motel-based accommodation to get people off the street and stable, instead of what's happening right now, where we're seeing huge groups of people being shifted onto the streets and into really unsafe environments, right? So, do that immediately. Ensure that, there is a directive that young people or whānau that are experiencing homelessness or have housing insecurity are immune from sanctions. That's something else that is, a huge barrier in terms of support and puts a lot of whānau at risk. But in terms of how we start to move out of this, look, we already have models, as I said. We need to develop an immediate housing pathway. So that is looking at ensuring that we have a range of immediate housing services. So that's instant access, 24/7 wraparound support. As I said, there's a couple of models we've talked about already. Putamata of Kaha, they've got a model, we've got a blueprint. I know there's other organisations that are starting to have those conversations now and are exploring how they innovate off that model, right? The Safety Net Host Home Network, another real light touch model, which is, being proven kind of over in the UK and the US to do similar models, and another real preventative model. So start to build that immediate housing system. We're always going to need to have a crisis spot, right? Invest in, integrated service centres, similar to where we are right now, the front door, right? It's a space which integrates a range of different services and supports and ensures that whānau rangatahi don't slip through the cracks, right?
So you've got a kind of navigator function here, operating here.
Totally.
Yep.
So if a young person walks in here, we'll be connecting them to the services and building, or whatever they need, right? So there's no wrong door. You come here, we figure out where you need to go. Auckland City Mission, LifeWise Merge Cafe. There's already a range of these services that exist. We need to ensure that we have that function in every city, and also in the right spaces in a city. Auckland's a big city. There needs to be the right kind of integrated service centres in the right spaces, so that if you're a young person, a rangatahi, tamariki, whānau, you can get access to the support.
So Aaron, are you finding that your youth people who are in here meeting with your team are having a different experience in an MSD office? Is that the reason that so many people are coming here?
Yeah, so basically we've been able to work with MSD to create a far more streamlined pathway and to support. And so, one of the things we've been able to do, especially when the changes around emergency housing happened, is we went and built our own relationships with lodgers and landlords and built a relationship with MSD. And basically we've got a situation where we can get a young person from street to shelter within an hour, right? So if a young person walks in the door, we can contact the landlords that we have, who's got a vacancy and who can take a young person tonight. Then we speak to MSD about streamlining that paperwork and getting them into a place immediately, right? And then we will do the long-term navigation to make sure that they don't slip through the cracks. So,
thank you for explaining.
Yeah, totally. And then there's obviously health and there's support. So we have a nurse that comes on site, once a week. We have other services that we work with to ensure that we kind of provide that wraparound support, whatever is absolutely necessary for the rangatahi, right? So those sort of services are really important. What we know from, I guess, the conversation even internationally is that one of the real places where homelessness occurs is the gaps, right? So we need to have services integrating, coming closer together and ensuring that young people don't slip through the cracks. So the front door kind of provides some of that support, ensuring that if a young person walks in our doors, we don't discharge them, right? We're going to continue working with them until they're stable. And so that it's going to be more intensive at some points. At other points, other agencies are leading that and we're stepping back, but they can always come back. And we can always, we can pick that back up again. So those sort of long-term navigation services are really necessary. We know that, one of the challenges, especially for our young people, is that often they come from communities that are struggling themselves and they don't have the social infrastructure around them to be immune and resilient to homelessness long term. And so we've got to start building that infrastructure. And we need to start thinking about how do we design and fund the resource services to do the long journey with our young people, with our tamariki, so that, hey, you might do a bit of work and they're doing really well and the whānau's kind of stable, but then, 6 months' time, something falls down. There's the capacity to reach back out and stay in touch, and they don't fall through the cracks. And so, there's some of those kind of more immediate crisis things that we need to ensure are part of, I guess, the system as a whole. We've talked about, I guess, the opportunity within, the youth service contracts. There's an opportunity that if you actually resource that well, reduce the caseloads of those young people, those youth workers, ensure there was, access to immediate accommodation, you can actually start to have and start viewing that service as a youth homelessness prevention service. You're going to have quite a wide impact because the contract that MSD already has across the country, right? And you've got providers that are delivering that, nationally. So there's opportunity there. One thing that we really believe is also really important is we've been talking for a little while around duty to assist legislation. So duty to assist was brought in by Wales. Basically, we'll bring it into a New Zealand context. If we had a duty to assist legislation, what that would mean is that if you went to work and income and you're experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, you would be entitled to housing support, right? And
is there an age profile to this?
Yeah, we would be anyway, right?
Oh, okay, right. So if you're a human being, duty to assist.
Right. It basically clarifies state's responsibility to support our whānau, our rangatahi, our tamariki into housing, right? So if you walk into work and income and say, look, I'm experiencing homelessness or I'm at risk of homelessness, then MSD would have to pick up that duty to assist and do everything they could do, obviously recognising the limits of the resources we have, but everything they could do to ensure that whānau got supported both in the immediate but also into the long term. And what they did in Wales is they actually defined what safe, stable housing looks like. And so, it's not going to solve everything overnight because we're still dealing with a housing crisis. We still don't have all the housing that we need to really respond to this issue. But one of the things Wales saw was that they started to get much better data. We have a real issue around data in this country in terms of homelessness. And so if we've got a duty to assist, we're picking up that responsibility, we're recording that data, and we start to see, well, actually we know in this area in Auckland, there's not enough immediate housing. Actually, there's none. So we need to invest in there. And there's not enough community housing or public housing in West Auckland and South Auckland. So those are places where we need to invest in. So it starts to tell us where the problem is, where the state's been able to discharge their duty to assist, and where they couldn't because they couldn't meet the obligations that they were sitting with. So it gives us much better information.
What would it take, do you think, Aaron, for us to get that over the line in the New Zealand context? Are there any political parties talking about that?
Yeah. I mean, we've had conversations with National Labour, the Greens, Tāmaki Makaurau. There seems to be an interest in it. I think it's pragmatic, right? Because, and it's, I guess, understanding that, homelessness is a structural issue. And I think we've had this issue in New Zealand. We've thought about it as like an individual moral failing. But this is something that could happen to any of us. Yeah. And so when you start to understand that actually there's real barriers in this country to be able to access housing, and if you or I ended up in a situation where we had nowhere to go tonight, the infrastructure is not necessarily there to support you. And sometimes, what we're seeing is there's a lack of understanding when a person's walking into a work and income office, acknowledging our colleagues at MSD that do some really important work to try to open up access and do what they can, and be creative and working with their partners. But there can be a breakdown sometimes in understanding. And so duty to assist would clarify everyone's responsibilities and would help us understand, okay, we need to just do something. What are those things that we need to do? And what they did in Wales is very similar in terms of the challenges. They made sure that actually the autonomy stood with the individual, that as an individual you can say, hey, if that housing environment you're sending to me is actually not suitable for me, my whānau, my kids, I'm not going to be safe there, or maybe I'm going to have to pull my kids out of school to go over there. They can't be penalised for that. And sometimes this will happen, right, where you say, well, you need to just take the option that's in front of you, and otherwise we're not going to provide you with support. And so just clarify that, if an individual is needing housing support, if they're in crisis, that we need to provide that support immediately, and then we need to keep providing that support until we get into stability. But alongside that would be a duty to refer. And so it would again widen that understanding we have as a community that this is a problem we all have a role to solve, right? And so we talked about some of those pipelines into homelessness before. Let's talk about the health system, right? So you had a young person there, or a whānau, anyone, that was had nowhere to go after leaving maybe ED, maybe they're in a mental health unit. There would be a duty to refer to MSD, right? That system, that service, that agency would need to provide the referral, and then they would need to make sure that was picked up before a discharge could happen.
Yes, again, so, there's another gap in our system because we see a lot of discharges or releases to homelessness.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so what the duty to refer would do, and what we would hope is it would be both for public agencies, but also for community agencies that are working in these spaces. It would start to create a responsibility around, you need to do an assessment. You need to have a policy around what happens when you meet a young person or a whānau who are experiencing homelessness. What's your assessment look like? How do you make sure you discharge your duty to refer? What's that process? And so to get us all thinking around, okay, whether I'm a GP, whether I'm, a teacher or a dean at a school or a school counsellor, whether I'm working in ED, what is the process to one, screen for homelessness and to ensure, knowing that this is a big piece of the context that we're dealing with here in Aotearoa, what's the process to screen that? And then when we do, how do we discharge this duty?
Aaron, you've talked about this duty of care, and for me, the language sounds like it could be quite helpfully a sort of a legal framework that could sit in common law, which would be helpful if it's already done in Wales and we share our common law in New Zealand with the British legal tradition. Is it a legal construct? Am I right to think that that's sort of where it sits?
Yeah, I do think that it needs to be legislative, right?
Okay.
We need to ensure that there is because that'll drive a structural change, which will have us to respond to it. There were some trials, I think it was in Ireland, where they tried to do something similar, and it was set more at a policy level, right? And then what they saw happen was that governments changed, ministers got busy, new people, different heads of ministries changed, people, whatever. And it just fell off and it didn't continue. So what they learned is you need to have it legislative, and there needs to be a watchdog that's looking at that and making sure that, various ministries are accountable. And so there's some oversight to that. And we have a range of frameworks we could use. With the Ombudsman, you've got, various, Human Rights Commissioner, you've got the Children's Commission. There's different mechanisms we could look at. Without setting up something completely new, they could say, hey, you've got a bit of oversight over that, make sure that this is being looked at and there's some kind of accountability if things fall through.
I love the idea of the longevity and permanence of that structural approach, and I totally agree with it. Right now in the New Zealand context, much of the work that's been going on is perhaps at risk as the Ministry of Housing dissolves into a new MCERT ministry, and things can get lost, as you say, with changes of government.
And one of the things that it does is that, if we've got the duty to assist, we've got the duty to refer. Even in terms of an NGO, there's a responsibility to have policy and process, and you're audited on that, especially if you've got contracts with government. I think we all know that, right? So now you've actually got to start thinking about, well, what is my responsibility, and what do I do, and how do I ensure my kaimahi know that? Blah, blah, blah. So it starts to actually shift this long-term, way of thinking of this issue from being an individual moral failing to actually something we all fairly understand. It's actually a much bigger structural issue, and then we've got to ask ourselves, what's our responsibility? How do we work? If I leave my organisation, what's my responsibility to ensure when a young person or a whānau or someone walks in our doors that we are doing what we can to respond to this need? There's one other duty that would be there as well, right? It would be the duty to collaborate. We know that there is often times where whānau or young people slip through the cracks because of really arbitrary lines around funding or barriers between, we deal with this all the time in terms of the mental health system, right? A young person may be receiving support in one area of the city, and then because of homelessness, they end up going everywhere and they get discharged from one community mental health team to another, and then they actually completely slip through the cracks. Well, if you had the duty to collaborate, you'd also be obligated, different ministries, different organisations, to say what is in the best interest of that young person. We recognise that homelessness is not easy to quantify. You can't put it on there's no, fixed address for someone that's got nowhere to stay, right? And so we need to work together to stabilise this whānau, to stabilise these young people. If it's maybe a whānau saying, actually, the best school for this whānau, for the tamariki to be in is this school, and that's going to, you know, might not be within your jurisdiction, but also this mental health team, they're the best one, they're working together. We need to work together to ensure that people stabilise and get the support that they need.
Yeah. Change of direction slightly from the structural to the individual. I'm really interested to hear your reflections on who you're seeing, and I obviously don't want you to name names, but I'm really interested. We've been having meetings all over the country with different people at the front line. What are the characteristics? What are the demographics of the people that you're serving most at the moment? And has that changed recently, or is it fairly consistent?
Yeah, cool. Well, I'll name one last structural thing which will lead us into this, right?
Yeah.
So we also really believe there needs to be a real clear commitment from government to build a lot more public housing and provide far more community housing, right?
Yes.
There is, especially for young people right now, there is no real right to housing for rangatahi. And the young people we see coming through our doors, often when they're experiencing homelessness, they're significantly unwell. They've got real, many of our young people have real complex needs around mental health, disabilities, addiction, have suffered very significant trauma, and they're in the midst of a crisis, and are often really unsafe. And right now, because of those real high needs, they're often unable to access, you know, existing, you know, transitional or even youth housing services just because of the level of their need. And really, they just need access to housing, long-term, stable, permanent housing. And so there needs to be capacity to ensure that young people can be prioritised and be provided with, you know, stable accommodation, and that they can know, look, if this is where you're going to be, you can live here, you know, and we can provide the support, we do the wraparound. But for us to actually, you know, we talk a lot about housing first in this country, but I don't believe we're fully living that, right? Housing first is more than a program, it's a philosophy, it's a belief that human beings deserve the right to be housed, you know, not based on any preconditions, or not based on whether you sign up to a kaupapa or a program, or, you know, you're going to do the things that we think you need to do to be well. It's actually human beings deserve to be housed. Human beings should be housed, and that right should be extended to our young people, right? And so if we're going to solve this issue, we definitely need more housing, but the private sector is not going to resolve this for us, right? We know that our young people are not going to get access to, you know, stable long-term housing through the private sector, and so we do need to start looking at, well, what is that pathway to really scale up, you know, community and public housing, so there is access to housing for rangatahi, and they should be prioritised on the housing list, right? So that's saying there. In terms of that demographic, look, over 60% of our rangatahi are rangatahi Māori, right? So there's some real big questions we've got to ask here around, you know, why is that? You know, I think when we speak to our young people around their experiences of homelessness, you know, they really see their experience in the context of colonisation and land loss, right? They see a direct link between what they and their whānau experience and this long-term injustice that is endured within Aotearoa. And so there is, you know, the conversation on Te Tiriti is so vital around what does it mean to actually to resolve this and ensure that our whānau, our rangatahi have, you know, again, the right to housing, the right to place, that we support iwi and whānau and their aspirations to have their whenua back, and we have that kōrero, and we ensure that we're actually addressing those real big systemic issues, right? The mental health we've talked about, addiction, often all three of these things, you know, mental health, addiction, disabilities, often all come together. We see a lot of young wahine who are significantly unwell and often don't get the support they need because they exist in all these different spaces, and the services that they often interact with will say, oh, sorry, that's a disability need, or that's a mental health, or that's addiction. It's actually all sitting there together. And so there's a real gap there in terms of safer, stable housing for young wahine with really complex needs. You know, even treatment and care in terms of that. We're seeing a lot of our young people with intellectual disabilities, or FASD, right? Young people that are probably going to need lifelong support, you know, going to need some form of, you know, wraparound support and safe, stable space to live for probably most of their life. And there's a real gap there right now. It's something that we're really concerned about, especially around FASD. Young people that either present as having FASD or have had diagnosed when they were young, when they were in care. And there right now, there just isn't the the infrastructure in place to care for these kids, and that's something that's really concerning to us.
Aaron, as you look to the near and medium term future, what are your aspirations and plans? Where do you want to take this movement, the programs you're involved with? What are the priorities for you as you sort of look out at the horizon a little bit?
Yeah, look, I mean, the goal is not to exist, right? You
Yep.
know, we'd love to shut Kickback down in 50 years, because we have done the work we need to do as a country to ensure that we have the services and systems in place, that if a young person is ever at risk of homelessness, that the support is there for them and for their whānau, so that they don't go through that experience, right? And that's actually totally achievable. There's a lot of work that if we, went at pace and at scale and actually started to get into the weeds of what's going on within our various systems, even before we started spending more money, actually just looked at where the breakdowns within systems are, we could start to resolve some of this stuff, right? So, I mean, that's the goal. That's the aspiration, right? In the meantime, what we do is, we believe in not letting the perfect defeat the possible. So where are the gaps and what can we start doing about that? And, right now it's this immediate crisis space. There's definitely gaps around the mental health and addiction system and how young people get the support they need there. And, long-term housing for our young people as well. It's really important to resolve. Yeah.
Well, Aaron, there's a broad range of views in New Zealand society around rough sleeping, homelessness, and a heck of a lot of it actually is invisible. Couch surfing, cars under bridges. There's that moment of where you see people crossing the road to avoid a streetie or a rough sleeper in the centre of town. It seems that this government is about to move on legislation which will empower the police with no criminal cause or justification to move on rough sleepers and homeless people throughout Aotearoa. Have you got a view on how that sits with us as New Zealanders in 2026?
Yeah, look, we're definitely very concerned around that. But look, if we think about the reality of the challenges we're facing, and as things specifically into the city centre, right? The situation we have is we have whānau, we have friends, we have neighbours, we have Aucklanders that have nowhere to go. And so they've ended up coming into the city centre because for some people there's a level of safety there in terms of being surrounded by people, being surrounded by lights, rather than sleeping in some forgotten alley out in the suburbs. There's a level of community safety being around people, right? So they've come here because they can't get access to housing. Some of these people have gone to work and income, they've asked for support and they've been denied that support, and so they've ended up sleeping rough as a result of that. And they're in this situation because of structural decisions that our government has made, right? That policy around emergency housing, that was a decision, right? And we need to understand that. And so, look, we all agree that our whānau shouldn't be living in motels, but also sleeping on the street is just not the answer for that. To bring in this legislation and to give that power to the police, we're really concerned that it's going to drive more of our whānau, our rangatahi, our tamariki, further and further into the forgotten suburbs, where there'll be an increased risk of harm, and also they won't be able to get access to the support they need, and more likely their experience of homelessness will endure for much, much longer. But I also really highlight that a rough sleeping ban, move on orders is absolutely unnecessary, because we already have solutions and are working on those in terms of how we, as I said before, we can support a young person from referral from street to shelter within an hour, and that's through the work that we've done through building relationships with MSD, with landlords, and I know many of our colleagues in the sector can do similar things, right? So if the government was really serious about addressing this issue, there's some things that they can do, right? So they can increase resources to outreach services to get out into the community and actually build those strong relationships that we need to.
Because that's working really well.
Yeah, and it is working. It is. Where the challenges are is capacity, because the need is huge. So we could be resourcing that, right? We could be ensuring that we're investing in, integrated service centres, services like the front door, where a young person can walk in the door and get access to all the support they need in one place, and we can start helping them navigate the system. So where it's working really well. Where it's struggling is capacity, right? So there's more resourcing needed within our community to actually do this at scale. We could ensure that we're investing in immediate housing services. Well, that infrastructure is already there. Again, we've mentioned Aotearoa and Pitamata and the awesome work that Barbara's leading over there, and the safety net of Massive Community Trust and Kickback. That's a couple of models where immediately we can get access to support and we can move young people or whānau from the city centre into housing and into support.
And we could replicate those models and scale those models.
We could replicate them, we could scale them. You know, I know across the country, there are organisations that are really willing, able to pick up this mahi, right? They need the belief and the support from government to do it. So the solutions are actually in our hands already. Our community know the answers. In many cases, we're already doing the work. What we need is our government to come and listen to us, have a court at all, and actually say, well, what are the real challenges and how do we resolve them? A ban is not going to solve this issue. It's going to drive more of our whānau further and further out into the suburbs potentially, and it's just going to shift that challenge on, and people are going to get hurt, they're going to suffer for longer, and they're not going to get the support they need. And in the worst case, well, it's all pretty worst case scenario. On the other side, some of our whānau will just end up being criminalised as a result and end up in the justice system for the crime of not having anywhere safe to live. And that's nothing that they have any power over. And so, yeah, look, there are solutions to this. This is not, oh, well, it's such a big issue, we can't solve it. We can solve it. You know, there's so many glimmers of hope within our community already. There's so many people and organisations and even, you know, public servants leading important work that just needs to be prioritised and driven forward and provided the resources to make it happen.
Beautiful. Building on that and talking about the people of New Zealand, civil society, church groups, iwi, hapu, community providers, agencies of the Crown, local government. It seems to me there is a real opportunity, and it might be described as a coordination opportunity, where there are a lot of pockets of resources, processes, programs, but that weaving part maybe is the missing part rather than the goodwill. I think most New Zealanders would love to see their fellow citizens well housed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like first thing to really like recognize and remember is that think about it. This thing I think about often. You know, I look at my kids, right? I'm like, what future do I want for them? What, you know, if something happened to me and my wife, like, where are these kids going? And right now, it terrifies me to think that could happen, right? Because we don't have the system set up for them. But think about your kids and think about the kids that you know. This could happen to you. This could happen to your whānau. This could happen to your neighbours, right? Think about your kids' friends. You know, so what world or system would you like designed to care for the people that you love? And then right now, do you trust that they're going to get the care and love that you think that they need, right? Or that they deserve? And the answer for me right now is no. Right? We don't have the systems in place to look after my kids in the way that I would hope they would be looked after, right? And so then the next question is, well, what can you do about it, right? And we all have different areas of influence. And so whether you're a teacher or a nurse or, head of a department, we don't need a duty to assist legislation to start thinking about, well, what would our process be in our organisation if someone came to our doors and they were experiencing homelessness? We run a housing service or not. How would I respond to that? What resources do I have, or what influence do I have to actually care for the kids or the young people or the whānau that might be experiencing homelessness? What could we do about that? There's actually far more that we can all do. Whether you're a church community or you're a faith community or just a community group, in some way you may be touching on this issue. So what can you do to start organising your own community, or start actually starting to think about, well, if someone came into my service or into our church or into our community and they had this experience, what would we do? And just start designing your solutions, because I think the power is in our hands, right? There is so much we can all do. There's so much work that we need to do, and it's across every system. It's not just the homelessness, those working with homelessness or those working in housing that are going to resolve this. It's in healthcare. It's in child welfare. It's in the social sector. It's in mental health. It's everywhere. And so, what do you have in your hands, and what can you do about it? And one thing we really believe at Kickback is you don't let the perfect defeat the possible. So don't try to be perfect. Don't try to fix it all. Don't try to solve the whole issue. Well, what's the tiny bit you can do, even imperfectly, to start making a difference?
That bit that's closest to the edge that's closest to wherever you are, and
totally.
Whatever you're doing.
And it'll grow from there, right? Start there and it'll grow out.
Yeah, it reminds me of He Waka Eke Noa, right? And I think it's dawning on more and more New Zealanders now than it maybe has ever before, that it could be you, it could be me. I've just been yesterday to the funeral of my brother-in-law, who was living in a Kaingaora house, but he had the tenancy agreement, and my nephew, his son, has been given 28 days notice and is being pushed into homelessness. And it just reminded me how close to home this stuff is, when our policies at the moment, that's the outcome. I don't think it's intended.
No.
but that's the outcome of his father dying.
And this is why I think we need to really frame this. We need to understand that we are dealing with a crisis, right? And it's something that can affect any one of us, and we need to move at pace to start to address it, right? Because it could be your whānau, could be your friend, anything can. And current, I think we're all starting to understand in the current economic crisis that we're in. We could all be very well affected by this, right? I'm a renter, right? And whenever we're looking for a home as a whānau, I feel that same anxiety. We've got to move, and like, man, and we're lucky we managed to find a place, right? But not everyone is, and it's very easy to end up in a situation where you're couch surfing and then you're moving around, and it just gets harder and harder from there.
I mean, ending with a little bit of hope. Every community I go to across the country, from Kaitaia to Invercargill, I feel like New Zealanders get it. There's a sense of what's right, and that homelessness is not right, but it's around what can we do? And
I think one thing we can start doing, even outside of doing anything else, is actually just start believing it's possible. Homelessness is not something we have to accept in New Zealand. It's unacceptable. None of our kids, none of our whānau, none of our friends, our family should ever experience homelessness, and we can solve this issue.
Yeah. Aaron, on behalf of the sector, thank you for all the work, the passion, the drive. We're with you on that. We're up for co-designing that plan. And thank you very much for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Cheers, fella. Cheers.
We'd like to thank Aaron for taking the time to speak with us for this episode. More information on this interview can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Char Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.